I was not yet a master when he died, though the city had already begun to whisper my name in crowded workshops and dusty market alleys. Leonardo, the apprentice with the unquiet mind. But no matter how far I thought I'd come, nothing prepared me for the day I stood alone in Maestro Verrocchio's studio, with the shutters closed, the scent of old oils clinging to the walls, and the weight of his absence bearing down like wet plaster before it sets. They buried him quickly, as was the custom. No grand farewell. Just a stone marker and a few of us standing in the winter wind, pretending not to shiver. He'd left no family, only a will with a short list of debts, some scattered tools, and one line addressed to me, written in a hand that trembled more than I remembered, to Leonardo, the key is yours. What you find, you must judge with your own conscience. It was delivered to me in a leather pouch by a man I did not know, whose face I can recall only in fragments, scar across the brow, hands too clean for a tradesman. He said nothing. Just handed me the pouch, bowed once, and left. Inside was a small iron key, older than I expected, wrapped in linen and stained with what I assumed was age. Only when I returned to the studio that night did I discover the lock it belonged to. Behind a canvas of unfinished saints, there was a wall panel slightly misaligned. Not noticeable to the untrained eye, but I'd spent enough hours staring at the studio's corners to catch the irregularity. The key turned with a reluctance that suggested it hadn't been used in decades. When the panel finally swung open, I found a wooden chest no larger than a butcher's crate. On its lid, burned into the wood, was a symbol I had never seen before, a circle intersected by a triangle, and through both, a line drawn with trembling precision that I hesitated. Not out of fear, curiosity always overrode fear in me, but because I realized, instinctively, that whatever I found inside would alter the path I walked. Up to that point, my work had been sketches and sculpture, flying machines no one believed in, paintings commissioned by men who wanted to immortalize their chins. But this was something he hadn't shared with anyone, not even me. Inside were documents, brittle with age, and beneath them, a series of copper plates engraved with symbols I could not yet decipher. Diagrams, anatomical, mechanical, celestial, and at the bottom, wrapped in a velvet cloth darker than wine, a small object that did not belong to our time. It was a lens, unlike any I had ever held, clear as the Adriatic and unnaturally cold to the touch. When I peered through it, the flickering candlelight around me warped, and for the briefest second, the very air seemed to breathe differently. That I spent the next week in near isolation, locked in the studio, deciphering the notes, sketching the plates, testing the diagrams by candlelight and moonlight alike. The lens, it was no mere magnifier. When held against certain angles of the plates, lines appeared that weren't etched into the metal. Instructions. Warnings. By the sixth night, my sketches began to mirror shapes I hadn't drawn consciously, spirals within spirals, impossible curves. And that's when the dreams began. They weren't nightmares, not exactly. But in them, I stood in a city I did not recognize, beneath stars I could not name. I saw machines I had not yet imagined, some of them soaring, others burrowing, one, I remember this vividly, turning water into light. The air in the dreams was always colder than it should have been. And somewhere, always just out of view, stood a figure watching me. Not approaching. Not speaking. Waiting. On the seventh night, I awoke with ink on my hands and a design on the parchment beside me I did not recall drawing. A sphere within a cube, suspended by magnetized columns. It pulsed. Or rather, I thought it had. Only when I turned away did I realize the lens was missing. That I searched the studio 3 times. Tore apart every drawer, every pocket of cloth. But the lens was gone. Only the sketches remained, of mechanisms that frightened me not because they were dangerous, but because they were possible. That same morning, I noticed footprints near the studio's back door. Muddy, shallow, leading nowhere. Someone had been inside. Or perhaps never left, and I, Leonardo da Vinci, apprentice no more, found myself standing on the edge of something that felt much larger than art, larger even than science. My master had left me more than a studio. He had left me a threshold, and now, I had already crossed it. The days that followed passed in a haze, the kind that creeps into a man's bones when reason and wonder begin to blur. I tried to resume my work as if nothing had changed. Patrons expected sketches, the city expected progress, but my hands trembled when I held a brush, as if they'd been taught something new and unspoken, and now could not bear to paint anything so ordinary as a commission. The world around me remained the same, the clang of hammers in the foundry across the street, the smell of bread from the market, the shouts of children chasing each other through the narrow alleys of Florence. But I had been somewhere else. And a part of me hadn't come back. That I revisited the chest. The plates were as I had left them, though I now studied them with a reverence usually reserved for scripture. I began to trace the strange markings under different kinds of light, morning sun, oil lamp, moonlight. Each revealed subtle variations, hidden figures emerging only at specific times of day. One diagram, when held near fire, revealed a constellation map unfamiliar to any I had studied. Another, dipped briefly in water, shimmered faintly before fading. I realized these weren't mere instructions. They were tests. Triggers. Designed by someone who knew that knowledge was only for those willing to work for it, and risk for it, but the lens was still gone. Then, a week later, I received a letter. It arrived folded into a small square, slipped between pages of an anatomy book I kept locked away. No seal. No signature. Just 3 words, written in careful Latin: "You are seen." I did not show the letter to anyone. Not even Lorenzo, my only confidant in the city, and a man who prized logic above all else. Instead, I burned it. I watched the flame consume it slowly, the letters curling into nothing, and yet, I felt no relief. Whoever had written it had not needed to sign it, they had known exactly where to place it, and that alone spoke volumes. The next night, I stayed awake in the studio with a blade hidden beneath my robe, more out of instinct than intent. I wasn't afraid, not truly, but I understood now that curiosity came at a cost. Around midnight, I heard movement. Not footsteps, but the soft rasp of something brushing against wood. I did not move. The sound faded. When morning broke and the light poured in, I found no signs of intrusion. No footprints this time. But on the table where I'd left my incomplete sketches of the lens, there now rested a small stone, black, polished, with the same symbol from Verrocchio's chest etched faintly into its face. That I pocketed it and said nothing. 3 days later, I was summoned to the estate of Giuliano da Medici. That alone was not unusual. The Medici commissioned many works from me, though rarely with such urgency. The messenger who came for me did not offer details, only that I was expected that very evening. When I arrived, I was greeted not in the hall of statues, nor the usual salon filled with scholars and musicians, but in a private study with no windows and only one chair, which I was told to take. Giuliano entered not long after. He was alone, uncharacteristically so, and his usual air of charm was absent. He closed the door himself, turned the key, and stood with his back against it as though afraid of what might follow him in. "Leonardo," he said, "you are not in danger. But you must be careful." I said nothing. I didn't trust my voice to remain steady. He reached into his robe and produced a small wooden box, which he placed in my lap without ceremony. This came to us through indirect channels. We were told only one man in Florence could make sense of it. I opened the box and felt my breath catch, the lens, unmistakable. Intact. Resting atop a folded piece of parchment that bore a sketch, my sketch, of the magnetic column sphere I had not shown anyone. Ever. I looked up at him, and he saw the question in my eyes. "We have our own watchers," Giuliano said simply. "And they have theirs." I did not ask who they were. I suspected he would not answer. "I have done things, Leonardo," he continued quietly, "seen things, in the name of Florence. And I tell you this not as a patron, but as a man who has touched the edges of something else. If Verrocchio entrusted you with this, it was not just because of your talent. It was because he knew you would not look away." I left the Medici estate that night with the lens hidden beneath my cloak and the weight of a warning I could not ignore. I no longer doubted that I was being watched. The only question now was, by whom, and to what end? That night, when I returned to my studio, I did not sleep. I placed the lens atop the copper plates once more, and I waited. But I was no longer the only one waiting. Somewhere, out beyond the reach of candlelight, someone else had just taken their next step. That I no longer measured time by days, but by discoveries. The sun rose and fell, but I scarcely noticed, consumed instead by lines that bent in unnatural ways, figures that shifted meaning when viewed from different angles, and symbols that seemed to rearrange themselves when the lens passed over them under moonlight. The lens, my lens again, now returned, though by what hand and under what motive, I still did not know, had become the center of everything. Not because I trusted it, but because it refused to be ignored. On the 10th evening after my visit to the Medici estate, I discovered a pattern etched faintly along the rim of the lens. It appeared only when warmed by breath and viewed at an angle, like a whisper coaxed from silence. It was a sequence of numbers, 45, 18, 6, then a gap, followed by 3 vertical strokes. Coordinates? A code? I traced them again and again, until my fingers ached, and then did something I had not done since I was a child. I went to the monastery at San Marco and asked for access to their cartographic vault. Brother Matteo, the keeper of the maps, gave me a puzzled look. "You seek a chart of the stars or the land?" "Both," I replied, "if you have them." I told him little, only that I was researching an ancient work for a Medici commission, and even then his gaze lingered on me longer than usual, as if weighing something unseen. Still, he granted me an hour. In the back of the vaulted chamber, beneath shelves heavy with dust and rolled parchment, I found what I hadn't known I was looking for. A map of Florence, not as it stood now, but how it was drawn nearly a century earlier, when the Arno's banks were wilder, and the hills had not yet been consumed by villas and walls. In the upper right corner, written in a script I now recognized from Verrocchio's notes, was the same numerical sequence. And near it, a mark, just beyond the edge of the city, nestled in a grove once known as Il Bosco dell'Ossa. The forest of bones. That I felt the chill before I noticed the room had grown colder. Brother Matteo stood behind me, though I hadn't heard him approach. "Some places," he said softly, "are forgotten for good reason." I looked at him. "What do you know of this place?" He did not answer. He only held out a small slip of paper and placed it gently beside the map. On it was a single phrase, written in Latin: "They who awaken the sleeping past must be prepared to dream with it." And then, without another word, he turned and walked away. That night, I left Florence through the northern gate under cover of darkness, wrapped in my heaviest cloak and carrying only what I could hide beneath it: the lens, the sketch of the strange machine, and a dagger I hadn't used since I fled a riot in Milan years ago. I took no lantern. I did not need one. The moon was full, and it was enough that Il Bosco dell'Ossa had once been sacred ground, long before Florence was Florence. The trees grew wider there, as if age had thickened their bark and their memory alike. I followed the old map's markings past a dry creek bed and up a slope choked with underbrush until I came upon a half-buried stone. The symbol, circle, triangle, line, was faint, worn smooth by rain and centuries, but still there. I knelt. And I waited. I don't know why. Only that something inside me whispered, "This is where it turns." The lens, cradled in my palm, warmed slightly, then pulsed. Just once. As if confirming something I hadn't said aloud. I pressed it to the stone. Nothing happened. Then a sound, not a voice, not quite, but the soft hum of moving earth. Beneath the stone, a seam cracked open. I reached forward, heart hammering against bone, and lifted. There, buried beneath time, was a box, not wood, not metal. Something else. Some material I did not recognize. Smooth, seamless, colder than the lens even in the night air. I held it, and my hands trembled, not from fear, but from certainty that I had crossed some line. There would be no turning back now. I returned to Florence at dawn, hidden by the shadows of merchants opening their stalls. I said nothing to anyone. Not to Lorenzo, not to Giuliano, not even to the voice in my own head that now asked questions I dared not answer. I placed the box on my worktable and watched it in silence. Then, I began to dream again, but this time, the figure watching me was closer, and I recognized his eyes. They were Verrocchio's. I barely slept in the nights that followed, not for lack of trying, but because sleep itself had become a threshold, not a refuge. When I closed my eyes, I found myself somewhere else, beneath stone arches I did not recognize, among voices that whispered not in words, but in symbols. In one dream, I walked through a corridor lit by candles suspended in air, casting no shadows. In another, I stood before a vast machine shaped like an inverted heart, pulsing with a rhythm that felt human. And always, always, he was there. Watching. Sometimes beside me. Sometimes behind. My master, Verrocchio, though changed, his face drawn not by age, but by knowledge. A man who had seen too much. Each morning I awoke with his words in my mind, not ones he had spoken in life, but ones he seemed now to send from whatever place he lingered. Leonardo, the world you know was built to keep the truth from leaking. I no longer questioned the nature of the box I had found. It was not of this time, perhaps not even of this world as we knew it. But it had chosen to be found. Or someone had chosen me to find it. I examined it obsessively, sketching every angle, testing every surface. It bore no latch, no seam, no keyhole, only the faintest indentation in the shape of the symbol I now saw in everything: circle, triangle, line. My fingers hovered over it, but I hesitated to touch. It was not fear, it was reverence. Or perhaps some buried instinct urging caution, like a man standing too near a cliff that hasn't yet decided whether to crumble. That I had made the mistake once before of showing one of my more peculiar inventions, a flying wing too delicate for the air, to a Medici courtier. Days later, I found a crude replica being tested in a courtyard by a man with no understanding of balance, flight, or fragility. It failed, of course. But I remembered his laughter as it broke. Some knowledge is not for careless hands. So I waited, but not everyone did. Late one evening, I returned to the studio to find my parchments disturbed. Not missing, no, they were too clever for that, but shifted slightly, as if by someone careful enough to mask their presence, yet unfamiliar with the precision of my habits. I am many things, but not careless. I knew my own shadows, and then I noticed it. A single sheet of vellum, one I had never drawn, placed delicately atop the rest. Upon it, a sketch. Mine. Or something imitating my hand so precisely it chilled me. It was the machine from my dream, the inverted heart, but rendered in clearer detail than I had ever managed. My name was signed at the bottom. Not forged. Perfectly matched, except I had never drawn it. A single word was written beneath: soon. That night, I went to Lorenzo. I told him part of the truth, not of the box, nor the lens, nor the symbols, but of the studio being watched. Of the drawing. Of my growing suspicion that someone was manipulating events from behind the veil of ordinary life. He listened, as he always did, with that calm rationality that had guided so much of our work together. You believe you're being followed, he said at last. Or worse, anticipated. Yes. And you believe your master left you something that others want. I nodded. He was silent for a moment. Then, he rose, walked to the window, and stared out at the street beyond. The lamps flickered. The city murmured below. Leonardo, he said quietly, have you heard of La Fratellanza Nascosta? I hadn't. Not by that name. They call themselves the Hidden Brotherhood, Lorenzo said. Founded in the last days of the Eastern Empire. Not a cult. Not exactly. A society, cloaked in knowledge. Their purpose has never been fully understood, but their methods are unmistakable. They collect thinkers. Shape ideas before they're born. Ensure certain discoveries, never reach the light. I felt a weight settle in my chest. Why are you telling me this now? Because one of their symbols, he said, is a circle. A triangle. And a line. My breath left me. Verrocchio knew of them. I asked. Lorenzo's answer came after a long pause: no. But he feared someone. I remember, years ago, finding him staring into the fire. He asked me once, if you found a truth that could unmake the world, would you bury it, or teach it? I thought he was drunk. Now I'm not so sure. I left soon after, the conversation burning in my mind. If the Brotherhood was real, if they were already near, then I had to move quickly. The next day, I did what I had been delaying, that I placed the lens against the symbol on the box. It pulsed once. Then, without sound, the box unfolded, not opened, but unwrapped, as if it had always been waiting. Inside was a sphere. Black, translucent, floating in a nest of threads so fine they looked like hair. The sphere shimmered faintly. And inside it, impossibly, a constellation I did not recognize shifted with slow grace, and a voice, not in my ears, but in my thoughts, spoke 2 words, "Welcome, architect." Then the sphere dimmed. The studio grew cold, and I knew, beyond doubt, that I had been chosen for something far older than Florence, and far greater than invention. The following morning, Florence felt different. Not in any visible way. Markets bustled, artists argued, and bells rang in their usual harmony, but I walked its streets as one who had glimpsed a hidden gear turning beneath the skin of the city. I carried no drawings, no tools, only the sphere wrapped in linen beneath my cloak. It did not make a sound, yet I felt its presence as though it whispered in a language I had not yet learned but already somehow understood. That I returned to Verrocchio's studio, not for comfort, but for answers. The chest was still there, open now, a cradle without a child. I stared at the remaining plates, the incomplete diagrams, the strange reflections that still danced across their surfaces when sunlight struck just right. Then I noticed it. One plate, etched not in metal but in some stone so black it drank the light, shifted as I touched its corner. Beneath it, folded so tightly it had nearly fused to the chest, was a page. Verrocchio's handwriting, unmistakable. Leonardo. If you're reading this, then the lens has returned to you. And the sphere is awake. There is more I could tell you. About the Brotherhood. About what they once were, before fear made them dangerous. But the truth is, I no longer know which of us are the wardens and which the prisoners. The sphere will speak to you if it chooses. If it doesn't, bury it where no mind can reach it again. It was never meant to be finished. Only passed on. For a long time, I stood still, the letter trembling in my hand. I understood now that Verrocchio had not died only from age or illness. He had chosen not to finish something he feared to understand fully. And now, he had left it to me that I could have buried it. Left it in the catacombs beneath Santa Croce or sealed it behind brick and mortar in some forgotten cellar. But even then, even as the warnings echoed louder, I knew I would not. I am not Verrocchio. I am Leonardo. That night, I took the sphere into the hills outside the city, far from watchful eyes and cloistered minds. There, in a hollow between cypress trees, I placed it on a stone pedestal I had carved in silence. I did not know what to expect, light, perhaps, or sound, but when the sphere began to glow, it did neither. Instead, it opened my mind, not with visions, but with clarity. That I saw the design of a flying machine not yet invented but already perfect. I saw the structure of the human heart, not as I had drawn it, but as it truly moved in life. I saw time not as a river, but as a wheel with spokes radiating into lives I could not live, and yet somehow already touched. And I saw myself, not as I was, but as I might become, a man not simply of invention, but of revelation. When the light faded, the sphere dimmed once more. It had shown me enough that I buried it there, beneath the pedestal, and covered the place with stones. Then I carved only one thing into the base, in Latin, that which teaches must also forget. I never returned to that place. That I in the years that followed, I built machines that frightened kings, drew maps of muscles no surgeon had seen, and painted faces that seemed to know more than the canvas should allow. But there were truths I never shared. Diagrams never completed. And dreams I kept locked behind my eyes, where no one could find them. Sometimes, I would pass an alleyway and glimpse a figure watching. Or hear my name whispered where no mouth had formed it. I knew they were still there, those who watched, who waited. But I also knew this, I had not finished Verrocchio's work. That I had made it mine, and in doing so, I left behind more than inventions. That I left behind a legacy wrapped in silence, buried not to hide it from the world, but to let the world become ready for it. Perhaps one day, someone like me will find it again. That if they do, I hope they will be wiser, and if not, may they at least dream a little further.